Good afternoon. We're back on the record and the dockets number 2023-8E and 2023-10E, Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas LLC Integrated Resource Plan. And I think the last witnesses, you were asking for them to be excused until they come back up?
That's right, Chair. Thank you.
All right. Well, call your next witness.
Chair, with Ms. Smith and Mr. Snyder excused from the witness stand, we would next call witnesses Michael Quinto and Ben Pasty.
Come forward. Let me say first that all commissioners are present in the courtroom.
Great. Good afternoon, Chair Powers.
Gentlemen, if you would raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again. Brett Brightshort on behalf of Duke Energy. Good afternoon, Mr. Quinto, Mr. Pasty. How are you?
Good. Thank you.
Terrific. Great. Mr. Quinto, I'm going to start with you and get you introduced in the record, and then I'll turn to Mr. Pasty. Would you please state your full name and address for the record?
My name is Michael Quinto. My business address is 525 South Tryon Street, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28202.
Thank you. And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy as the Director of IRP Advanced Analytics for the companies.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 30 pages of direct testimony pre-filed with the Commission on October 24th, 2023?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
No, I do not.
And if I ask you the same questions today that were asked in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Chair Powers, at this time I would ask that Mr. Quinto's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Quinto will be entered into record as it's given orally from the stand.
Thank you. And Mr. Quinto, you also pre-filed a Quinto Direct Exhibit 1 as part of your direct testimony?
Yes.
And confirming you don't have any changes or corrections to that exhibit at this time?
I do not.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Mr. Quinto's pre-filed exhibit labeled Quinto Direct Exhibit 1 to be entered in the record as the next composite hearing exhibit. The
pre-filed exhibit of witness Quinto, known as Quinto Direct Exhibit 1, is marked for identification, will be placed in the record as exhibit number 6.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Quinto, to confirm, you did pre-file rebuttal testimony as well, and we'll be back to appear and present that rebuttal testimony later in the case.
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Did you prepare a summary of your pre-file direct testimony?
I did.
Will you please present that to the Commission at this time?
Yes. My direct testimony supports the company's modeling and analytical framework used to develop the 2023 IRP. In Section 2 of my testimony, I provide an overview of the company's approach to modeling. The company's IRP uses sophisticated modeling software, including Encompass for capacity expansion and production cost modeling, and Strategic Energy Risk Valuation Model, SERVM, for reliability modeling to develop portfolios that address the requirements of South Carolina Code Annotated Section 58-37-40, the IRP statute, and to provide the foundation of analysis necessary to determine the most reasonable least cost path for customers. My testimony explains the 4 primary analytical steps: modeling software and development of modeling assumptions, which consists of developing stakeholder-informed modeling assumptions and inputting those assumptions in the Encompass software to develop and assess resource portfolios. 2, the portfolio development step, which a range of portfolios are developed with a focus on minimizing system cost over the planning horizon, giving the specific inputs from various base and sensitivity planning assumptions. 3, the portfolio verification step, which assesses the performance of portfolios previously developed with respect to cost, reliability, and other system requirements on a chronological, hour-by-hour, detailed system simulation, and also assesses the portfolio's ability to meet resource adequacy and reliability of power supply. And 4, the performance analysis step, which further assesses the robustness of portfolios with respect to uncertainty in resource cost, commodity price, and other foreseeable conditions, while maintaining reliability to ensure the most reasonable, least cost portfolio that considers risk mitigation for customers is identified. Section 2 of my testimony also provides an overview of the changing energy landscape, which impacts the company's resource planning. I also discussed the company's coal retirement analysis, explaining that once final coal retirement dates were determined for each pathway, the companies used these retirement dates as inputs to the capacity expansion model to develop portfolios using each pathway's respective coal retirement schedule. I also explained that the economic verification step for the Bad Creek 2 project confirmed that the inclusion of this long-duration storage resource in the resource plan is economic for customers. I then provide an overview of the 3 core portfolios modeled in the initial plan, one corresponding to each energy transition pathway, and explain that the companies developed 13 other portfolio variants and 10 sensitivity analysis portfolios as described in Chapter 2, which explored a wide range of alternative input assumptions including resource availability, fuel supply, resource cost, and load assumptions and forecasts. I also discussed the 7 supplemental portfolios developed for informational purposes to explore factors such as the impacts of no carbon constraints on carbon dioxide emissions and the then proposed United States Environmental Protection Agency's rule under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, the proposed rule. Finally, in Section 3, I describe how the resource plan's modeling and analysis addresses the integrated resource planning modeling requirements as set out in the IRP statute and respond to integrated resource planning related directives from the Commission's previous integrated resource planning orders. I conclude my testimony by requesting the Commission to find the company's IRP modeling and process to be comprehensive and appropriate as it is robust and reasonable for planning purposes and allows the Commission to make a determination on the most reasonable and prudent plan to reliably serve customers over the next 15 years. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Quinto. Turning to you, Mr. Pasty, would you please state your full name and business address for the record?
Benjamin W. Pasty, 525 South Tryon Street, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28202.
Thank you. And by whom are you employed in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy as a load forecaster.
Okay. And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 15 pages of direct testimony pre-filed with the Commission on October 24th, 2023?
Yes.
And do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
I do not.
And if I were to ask you the same questions today that appear in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Thank you. Chair Powers, I'd ask that Mr. Pasty's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Pasty will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Pasty, to confirm you did not have any exhibits to your testimony.
I do not have exhibits.
Thank you. And you're also just here for the direct case and not for the rebuttal case.
That's correct.
Thank you. And Mr. Phil Stillman will be appearing on rebuttal, who addresses both load forecast and economic development matters for the companies.
He will be.
Thank you. And did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed testimony?
I did.
Will you please present it to the Commission at this time?
My testimony provides an overview of the load forecasting process, and it supports and highlights several key themes addressed in Appendix D, Electric Load Forecast, of the company's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan, henceforth IRP, or Resource Plan. The company's load forecast, which is developed in 4 key steps that I will explain shortly, is essential for determining how much and what type of generation, transmission, and distribution resources the companies will need to serve their customers over the forecast horizon. My testimony also identifies and explains 3 main drivers of the increase in the 2023 load forecast. After introducing my direct testimony in Section 1, Section 2 provides an overview of the load forecast development process, which is comprised of 4 essential steps. First, obtaining an economic forecast for the company's respective service territories. Second, preparing an energy forecast by estimating statistical models that predict the relevant energy measures based on these economic conditions. Third, developing ex post modifications to load, including the adjustments for the large economic development projects. And 4, using the energy forecast to develop summer and winter peak demand forecasts. I explained that retail load forecast consists of 3 major classes: residential, commercial, and industrial, and provide details regarding each class of customer, including explaining how weather impacts rooftop solar, utility energy efficiency programs, and electric vehicles are incorporated into the load forecast. In Section 3, I provide the company's load forecast results and drivers. I explain that much of this increase in the load forecast is driven by 3 major factors. Number 1, economic development growth associated with several new large customer sites. This demonstrates rapid acceleration in activity, with a whole series of new large investments that will require additional energy in the years to come. Number 2, increasing growth in the number of residential customers that has exceeded expectations over the past 6 years. And number 3, a surge in demand related to the energy that will power electric vehicles, which continue to grow rapidly. I highlight that the projected increase in large economic development projects over the 15-year planning horizon is the largest driver of the projected energy increase in the company's load forecast, and explain that the size, scale, and speed of economic development of these large projects has dramatically increased since the year 2020, such that a greater proportion of the portfolio is above a threshold of consideration that necessitates a large site adjustment to this load forecast. I also highlight that when calculated over the load forecast horizon presented, a period ending in the year 2038, growth rates are often different from the historical periods used to estimate the statistical models. I conclude my testimony by reiterating that an increase in the load forecast is expected because of the strong activity in economic development resulting in this list of large projects, and that the companies will keep the Commission apprised of any material changes to their load forecast in this proceeding. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Pasty. The panel is now available for cross-examination by the parties and questions from the Commission.
Let me just clear up one thing
Yes,
in
sir.
Mr. Brightsword. In Mr. Quinto's testimony, he does a legal analysis as to the statute and as far as what our determination would be. You're not offering him as a legal expert, are you?
No, sir, and I wouldn't characterize Mr. Quinto as presenting a legal analysis. I think he presents the modeling and analytics that address how the companies prepared the plan and how that informs the IRP planning requirements under subsection B of the statute. Is there a specific area of concern?
In his testimony, he's saying that the Commission should find the modeling conducted sufficiently complies with the requirements laid out in South Carolina Code annotated 583740 and other directives. I mean, you're not offering him as a legal expert.
No, sir, we are not. But I
Thank
think-
you.
Yes, sir.
Cross-examination, we'll start with Sierra Club.
No questions from Sierra Club.
Thank you. Coastal Conservation League.
Good afternoon, panel. My name is Emma Clancy, and I represent CCL et al. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay. Good.
thank you.
Is that better?
Much better.
Okay. Now, Mr. Passy, I have some brief questions for you. Now, your testimony supports the load forecast and sponsors Appendix D in the IRP, correct?
That's correct.
And you didn't submit testimony following the supplemental analysis, but is it safe to assume that you have continued to be involved in discussions around updates to the load forecast?
That's also correct.
Now, you just mentioned that the load forecast in this IRP covers through 2038. Is that right?
Yes.
So it includes near and sort of later planning periods, correct?
It is correct that those periods would be included if they're. It's a distinction that I don't interact with personally, but up until 2038 is covered by the work that I do.
Okay. So, I mean, it includes the 2020s and the mid to late 2030s, let's call it.
Yes.
Okay. And as a general rule, wouldn't you agree that longer term forecasts are subject to more uncertainties the further out you go?
There is an argument that the further out one goes, the harder it is to predict what conditions will be. But there is also a case that in planning, because of the ability to make investments and change plans, that there's more of an opportunity to prepare for that greater uncertainty as well.
Okay. Well, to your first point, there is a greater opportunity for conditions to change, whether those be economic, technological, or policy.
Yes.
Okay. Now, changing gears, I'd like to understand the economic growth components of Duke's load forecast. So the first component is from Moody's Analytics, is that right?
That's correct.
And so that forecast is specific to the Carolinas and consists of economic and demographic projections, correct?
Correct.
So in other words, it should reflect major economic trends, like, for example, a rush of development and growth in the Southeast.
It would reflect major trends that appear from the modeling that Moody's conducts.
Okay. And now for the sort of second economic component, Duke also increased the load to reflect a group of sufficiently certain mega projects, correct?
That is correct.
And that was in addition to the Moody's forecast.
Yes.
And prior to incorporating this additional load, Duke didn't consult with Moody's to determine the extent to which the Moody's forecast already reflected those large economic loads, did it?
There weren't any specific materials from Moody's that describe those projects, no.
Okay. And Duke didn't ask Moody's about that?
No. Periodically, our group will interact with the Moody's team to try to get a sense of their view of the economy, but we don't consult with them as far as planning how to interact with our customers, no.
Okay. Now, that sort of mega project load component, we can call it, that was in addition to Moody's, but it was also discounted slightly, correct?
That's correct.
And now Appendix D on pages 13 through 14 describes two purposes behind that discount. And first, it reduces the risk of double counting the same economic growth already captured in the Moody's forecast. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the other sort of rationale behind that discount is that it accounts for the, quote, uncertain future-oriented nature of the plans, unquote, correct?
Correct.
So, for example, that uncertainty might refer to if a mega project ends up backing out of Duke territory, right?
backing out or delaying.
or delaying?
Yes.
And could that uncertainty also refer to, the possibility that maybe under this clean energy tariff we heard about earlier, the customer develops a self-serve option in partnership with Duke Energy that doesn't impact the rest of the load?
So I think you're describing a situation where the customer has on site an ability to
Yes.
generate their own energy. And from the perspective of the calculations we do, that would have the same appearance as reducing their demand. Yes.
Okay, yes. Now, Appendix D says that this discount is around 30 to 60%, but witness Stillman clarifies that the discounts amounted to roughly 50% in the earlier years and tapered off to roughly 20% by 2033. Can you confirm, is that the discount approach Duke took?
I think that describes the aggregate numbers correctly, yes.
So can you confirm Duke discounted mega project load in the 2030s to a lesser degree than nearer term projects?
That is correct.
And there isn't a lower risk of double counting the two economic loads in the later forecast period, is there?
So with regard to the double counting specifically, the double counting has to do with the extent to which the economic drivers might predict growth that would happen organically. And that's not a factor that would change over time.
Okay, but the discount does.
The discount I think you're referring to about the planning uncertainty, that is something that is reduced. You're right. The uncertainty is reduced over the time in those numbers. Yes.
In those numbers. And you also said earlier that that discount was also intended to reduce the double counting aspect of this approach.
Yes, although the double counting part would be a static discount that would be held constant over time.
So that's a separate, okay. So there's two different discounts?
But the impact of the numbers that you described represent the sum of both of those efforts.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying, and thank you for answering my questions. That's all.
Next would be Walmart.
No questions, thank you.
Carolinas Clean Energy Business Association.
No questions for Sasiba, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. ORS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. ORS would like to reserve its cross for Mr. Quinto until he returns on a rebuttal.
Thank you very much. Commissioners. Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Mr. Pasty. Yeah, let me find it. Oh, on page 5, line 18, and page 6, lines 8 through 12, page 7, and so forth, where you're talking about the modeling and the various loads, and you talk about the energy efficiency. Let me read it. See, driven by weather and appliance efficiencies. The usage per customer forecast was derived using statistical just-in use model. Regression-based framework. I got to get down to where it was. Oh, I guess line 11 through 13, where you say it incorporates naturally occurring efficiency trends and government mandates more explicitly than other models, combining them with data on economic variables, price of energy, weather data, and so forth. And I'm assuming what I think I understand there is that particular model does that, especially like, well, not especially, but including like the energy efficiency of appliance and government policy existing, and I don't know about proposed, but existing. So when I read that, I was still trying to understand it all. But are you saying there that that model incorporates or considers, I guess, ubiquitous energy efficiency of most everything electric now?
Thank you, Commissioner. I am, and if I might have a chance to go into more detail, when estimating the statistical model, the goal is to take variations in energy and explain them by variations in your independent variables. In the case of the SAE models, which are used for customers, our residential or commercial class customers, we're able to create a term that interacts weather data as well as economic data with the output of an EIA survey that goes into the data about those appliances. So the data that we receive from the EIA REX survey include data on how efficient the appliances are expected to be going out for the years in the future, as well as for the history. So we're able to mix that historical data on efficiency as well as market saturation into a measure of demand for energy.
And I think you said that that model included, I guess, weather?
Yes.
Yep.
And we measure weather on a degree day basis from, so it's going, 0 would be a very comfortable temperature at 59 or 65 degrees. And so it'd be the amount of weather above 65 for the cooling end uses, air conditioning, or below 59 degrees for the heating end uses, which would include space heating, as well as demand for other drivers of that type. So for the base load part, it would be all of the remaining appliances, things like refrigerators or tablets, things that get plugged in year round.
Okay. So the model, at least relative to the weather, if I understand it, is not necessarily looking at historical weather data, but more, I guess, a statistical 3%, 2%, using that regression analysis.
Well, we use historical data for the weather that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And I go into more detail in the appendix about taking the weather measurements from different weather stations throughout the service territory. But for the future, we take expected weather, we refer to it as normal weather, which comes from taking an average of the last 30 years of historical weather data.
Okay. That's good. And you'd mentioned, I can't remember if it was in question with Ms. Clancy or whatever, talking about projections, growth demands, percentages,
yes.
That stuff. And I know with the graph or projections that was shown earlier, and it's in the IRP, in those early years, the lines kind of close together, pretty low slope, and then as you get out there beyond 2027, 28, they really kind of go up. I think what you said is the further out you go, the less certainty there is of the accuracy of that percentage of growth or demand.
Well, the argument about the uncertainty was that as you look at the trajectory of the economy, it depends. The path that you follow sets the place from which the next part of the path can be traveled. And so that would be the argument for increasing uncertainty going farther out. I think that the counselor's questions earlier had to do with the uncertainty regarding our projection for the energy of the large sites. And since those are a thing that we plan for and manage and interact with the customers on, we think that dimension of the planning reduces the uncertainty as we go out into the far future. But you're correct that with regard to the Moody's projections that we use, there would be that increasing uncertainty.
a lot of variables that can affect that.
We do, and we try to find the balance of those variables by how we follow the procedures with the historical data. So the thing that's powerful about the tool of the regression estimation is that it can show us in the historical data which factors are the most salient.
Final question or thought. Do you agree that there's more confidence in the shorter period of those demand projections than the long-term demand projections?
I would agree that there's less opportunity for things to change dramatically in the short term, but I would also caution, having lived through the dramatic disruptions a few years earlier associated with the public health crisis, that it's certainly possible to have very dramatic changes even in a short period of time as well.
Understand. I think that's it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Two quick questions, Mr. Pasty. One has to do with page 15 of your testimony, where you talk about if you were to conduct a full forecast refresh today, what you would expect. And my question, you probably don't need to be looking at it, but my question is, what prompted the supplemental planning analysis given that statement?
So organizationally, the need for the supplemental analysis could probably, the overview of everything that was going on in the organization could probably be handled better by other witnesses.
Okay.
From my point of view, the information that I saw was that during the summer and early fall of 2023, it was becoming apparent as we were interacting with the large company, a large customer management and economic development team, it was becoming apparent just how many more projects there were. And in particular, how many more of those projects had the potential to be 20 megawatt plus demand projects. And so from the point of view of the forecast, it felt as though the material that we'd provided in early 2023 felt stale.
I appreciate that. And my other question is, how in the world do you predict EV impact?
So the EV demand is handled by another team.
Okay.
I can give a headline
Okay.
to that, and we'll have, I think Witness Stillman may be
Right.
available for more
Okay.
questions. But yeah, we estimate a demand function not unlike the demand functions I estimate that predict sales based on economic conditions for people who are choosing whether to buy combustion engine cars or electric cars.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I can add, Commissioner.
Okay.
For the EV forecast that is developed by a separate group given to Mr. Pasty, it takes information such as types of models that are available in the marketplace, the incentives, the current cost, the relative adoption of those seen throughout history, and factors that into also infrastructure as that continues to grow. All of these are factored into that forecast that's used to project out into the future how much electric vehicle load will be incorporated into our forecast.
And who would you suggest that I ask that of?
Yeah, Mr. Stillman can certainly
okay.
provide more
Great.
details.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Belser.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Pasty.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to wait for you till later, Mr. Quinto. Mr. Pasty, just briefly, how often does Duke prepare the load forecast for something like this, like an IRP?
A typical schedule for refreshing the load forecast would be 2 times a year.
Okay. And that's what I was getting at, because I think y'all did the original IRP based on the spring forecast, and then the fall forecast showed such an uptick. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, so the timing of those would have been work that was being done in March of 2023. And then for the refresh, those were calculations based on information available to us in the late fall of 2023.
So going forward, if there was a significant deviation up or down in the load forecast, Duke would be aware of it in either probably the spring or the fall of a year?
It would depend on the source of that variation. The economic data that we use can be available depending on a certain schedule, whereas the appliance and efficiency data that Commissioner Caston asked about is typically updated only annually. I know that there's been a lot of interest in particular about the demand from the large sites, and that's something that because it's internal Duke data isn't fixed to a rigid schedule the way the outside data sources are.
But with using those internal figures, I understand that some of the outside figures may be a little more fixed, but with those outside, that outside information as well as internal information, Duke would have a decent idea of whether things were really outside the bounds of what has been forecast, either up or down. Is that correct?
So with respect to the modeling that I do, that twice a year schedule is something where we would start to see that there may be shifts in demand. I know that our modeling is just an input to Mr. Quinto's modeling, and I think you heard numbers earlier about how extensive and how many runs were done for that, and I couldn't speak for that schedule.
Okay.
I would say, Commissioner, certainly as we work with the load forecast, they're a critical input to the IRP planning models, setting the levels of load that we need to serve on a go-forward basis. And as we continue to interact with them over the course of the entire year, keeping the pulse of the economic development in the state, as they develop those forecasts, we'll review them. And in this case, for the supplemental planning analysis, coming back to Commissioner Williams' question, is that we saw such a drastic increase in this load that we identified it was going to require more resources to reliably maintain the system. And that really prompted us to come back to the commission with a supplemental planning analysis to factor in that increased load forecast. So we are constantly in communication with our load forecasters, understanding the impacts of that. And for the majority of the time, and as long as I've been doing IRPs, that hasn't any changes to the load forecast have been able to be incorporated into annual updates for the IRPs, but this one was really a special circumstance where just the amount of 27 large load customers, in addition to the 8 that were in the initial filing, really prompted us to reassess what are the generation and resource needs that we need to model the system.
And gentlemen, you've stated your responses much more eloquently than my question was, and I appreciate that. But I'm also thinking of this is a 15-year plan, and there's some maneuverability in there, and I'm just trying to get a grasp on the as conditions could change up or down, it may determine the path that needs to then be followed at that time. But appreciate your answers. Thank you very much. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Belcher. Any other commissioners? Mr. Pasty, I've got a couple of questions, and it's really just from sitting here looking at your title, Principal Load Forecast Analyst. And I've wondered, and I guess a lot of people have, did nobody see all this coming?
I think you're asking specifically about the economic growth, and there are parts of the growth that have taken shape. In my testimony, Commissioner, I mentioned 3 sources of the growth: the electric vehicle growth, the residential customer growth, and the large sites. With regard to the residential customer growth, we've seen outperformance in those numbers now for 5 years, going back even to an era before the disruptions of 2020. And so that's a case where it feels like a little more water drips on us each time we go through that forecast process. And we've statistically are impelled to increase our expectations for the number of customers. The source of energy for the electric vehicle forecast is one where even as we revisit the data, and again, other witnesses may be able to offer more detail here, but we're at close to the start of what will be a very dramatic transformation, that comes from this reworking of how energy is used by our transportation system. With regard to the large customers and the source of that growth, I think that a lot of the response there is responding to incentives that came from the Inflation Reduction Act and other large fiscal actions that have taken place just in the last few years. So given the relative recency of those actions, that growth is probably the newest of the three, and it's the one that we've been probably the latest to start grappling with seriously, which is not to say that we haven't had a process for assessing these large customers. There have been other times in the past where there have been sites whose size warranted consideration for making those kinds of adjustments to the forecast. But what's really changed is the size of that roster and the scope of the investments.
Well, it's such an increase, and it costs money. It costs a lot of money. Can you tell me a little bit about when you say mega projects? Are we talking about anything besides AI that's such a strong draw that's happening?
Sure. We track three categories of projects. There are large manufacturing types of sites, and in confidential responses to data requests, we've gone into more detail about the industries they're in. AI, I guess, could be a term that would apply to certain data centers as well, although a lot of the business of data centers also is serving more conventional needs that businesses and individuals have for their data to be in the cloud. So there would be both those commercial uses with the data centers as well as the industrial sites.
Well, and I guess part of my question is the data centers and these big power companies that the development that you're trying to serve. Is it fair for like retail customers to be paying for all the costs that benefiting data centers?
I wouldn't know how to speak to fairness. I know that the electric utility has an obligation to serve, and there may be other witnesses who are better positioned to answer that question about fairness.
Commissioner Powers, I'd certainly direct you to
Sure.
Witness Bateman on rebuttal testimony. Witness Bateman will be able to talk to you a little bit about your questions there. I will say some of the increases that we are seeing in the load forecast do also have the effect of putting some downward pressure on rates. They may require incremental resources, but they are also incremental megawatt hours to the system. So that's more megawatt hours that you can spread these costs out over. So there is some counteracting of incremental resources.
I've heard that phrase, downward pressure on rates, but I hadn't seen anybody's bill go down.
And I'm certainly not the right person to speak about how current rates are changing.
Okay.
Ms. Bateman can.
Well, thank y'all very much. That's all I have. Anyone else?
No redirect, and at the appropriate time, I'd ask for the witnesses to be excused with Mr. Quinto being resworn when he comes back up on rebuttal.
They are excused.
At this time, the company would call Mr. Nick Wintermantle to the stand.
Mr. Wintermantle, come forward to be sworn.
raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tracy DeMarco on behalf of Duke Energy. Mr. Wintermantle, would you please state your full name for the record?
Yes, my name is Richard Nicholas Wintermantle.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Strape Consulting. My current title is Chief Business Officer. At the time I filed my direct testimony, I was a principal at Strape Consulting.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 17 pages of direct testimony pre-filed with the Commission on October 24th, 2023?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
No, I do not.
And if I asked you the same questions that were asked in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Mr. Wintermantle's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Wintermantle will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Wintermantle, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 4 exhibits labeled Wintermantle Direct Exhibits 1 through 4 that were pre-filed in support of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes.
And do you have any changes to those or corrections to those exhibits at this time?
No.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Mr. Wintermantle's pre-filed exhibits labeled Wintermantle Direct Exhibits 1, 2, 3, and 4 be entered in as the next composite hearing exhibits.
The pre-filed direct exhibits of witness Wintermantle 1 through 4 are marked for identification. We place the record as exhibit number 7.
And Mr. Wintermantle, for clarity, you did not prepare any pre-filed rebuttal testimony in this proceeding, is that right?
That's correct.
And you will not be appearing in the rebuttal phase of this case?
I will not, but my colleague Cole Benson, who did prepare rebuttal testimony, will be available for topics that I'm addressing as well.
And so to be clear, Mr. Benson will be available to testify regarding any further questions on the 2023 Resource Adequacy Study and the Wind ELCC study?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Wintermantle, did you prepare a summary of your testimony?
I did.
And would you please present that summary at this time?
Yes, I will. So in my direct testimony, I provide an overview of the company's 2023 Resource Adequacy Study, as well as the Solar and Storage ELCC study and Wind ELCC study conducted by Strape on behalf of the companies. In Section 2 of my testimony, I explain that physical reliability refers to the expected frequency of firm load shed events, and that a utility will have a firm load shed event in the scenario when it must reduce load on the system by turning off power because it does not have enough generation to serve customers. Physical reliability is calculated in the study by using loss of load expectation, otherwise known as LOLE, which is the expected number of days in a year when the utility will not have enough resources to meet load and will have a firm load shed event. The industry most commonly uses an LOLE standard of 1 day in 10 years, which equates to an LOLE of 0.1 days per year. I explain that the minimum reserve margin the company should plan for in their IRP should be 22%. This is a 5% increase from the 2020 Resource Adequacy Study to meet the reliability standard of 1 day in 10 years, which equates to a loss of load expectation of 0.1 days per year. I explain that the 22% reserve margin is mainly driven by 3 factors: updated generator performance assumptions, economic load forecast error, and neighbor assistance. In Section 3 of my testimony, I explain that the Solar and Storage ELCC study and the Wind ELCC study were performed to analyze the capacity value, which is the reliability contribution of future solar, storage, and wind resources on the company's systems. The ELCC of each resource is driven by how it performs during winter morning peak periods, as that is when the companies show resource adequacy risk. For example, solar output is relatively low during those morning peaks, whereas storage and wind are able to provide more capacity during those periods. I also provide an overview of the ELCC study methodologies and results of the same. I then explain that solar, storage, and wind resources were evaluated on a level playing field with conventional resources such as gas by comparing them to a load that reflected a 4% D-rate. The 4% outage rate represents the high-end outage rate of new thermal resources and allows solar, storage, and wind resources to be more equally compared with new conventional resources. This concludes my direct testimony summary.
Thank you, Mr. Wintermantel. Chair Powers, Mr. Wintermantel is now available for questions from the parties in the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Marco. Sierra Club, any questions?
No questions from Sierra Club.
Thank you. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League,
No questions.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
Chair Powers, let's see if Mr. Burns might have questions for this witnesses. I don't have a report on that.
Mr. Burns.
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Witt.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Walmart.
Hey, Stephanie Eaton again for Walmart. I just have some clarifying questions based on your testimony and your summary now, since I understand you're not returning for rebuttal. Did Astrapi help Duke with its 2020 resource adequacy study?
We did.
And were you involved in that work?
I was involved in the 2020 study.
And was the result of the 2020 resource adequacy study a proposed winter planning margin of 17%?
Yes, and I think I mentioned that in my direct testimony. We are recommending that we move from 17 to 22%.
And I believe you just mentioned the three drivers behind your 5% increase. One of those was updated generator performance assumptions.
That's correct.
What are those assumptions?
Yeah, so in our process, we look at the previous 5 years of history of the generation fleet. So this comes to us through NERC GADS data. So we have kind of historical events for the entire Duke fleet for that analysis. So in the 2020 study, we looked at years 2014 through 2019. And similarly for this study, which was conducted in 2023, we looked at 2018 through 2022. As part of that analysis, we saw just overall generator performance, forced outage rates increase, and we also examined cold weather outages during that time period. So as we update data, our study is very much a data-driven process. As we receive that data, we include that in the study. It was updated. Our forced outages on our fleet had increased. We also saw, with kind of the older existing fleet, some cold weather outages that were shown in as part of reviewing the Winter Storm Elliott event.
And when you're referring to Duke's fleet, are you speaking of the fleet for just South Carolina or North and South Carolina, or its fleet in general, since it does have operations outside of the Carolinas?
Yeah, it's the combined fleet, so North and South Carolina.
Okay. You also mentioned in your direct testimony, again on page 4, that an economic load forecast error is one of the drivers.
That's correct.
Can you please explain that a little bit more? What are you talking about, economic load forecast error?
Yeah. So, as was really just discussed in the prior panel, there's uncertainty around load growth. And so we're looking out in that 3 to 5 year window. That's typically the time, maybe 3 to 6 year window, when it takes to build new resources. And so we want to understand, hey, we're projecting the load out 3 to 6 years in advance. What's the uncertainty around that load? And compared to the 2020 study, we took also Moody analytics data to develop those assumptions, and we saw an increase that impacted the reserve margin.
An increase in what? An error?
In load forecast, economic load forecast uncertainty.
You also mentioned one of the drivers is a neighbor assistance. That's one of the drivers, right?
That's correct.
And who were you considering neighbors?
Yeah, if we can, it's probably best just to go to my NW Exhibit 1. Actually, NW Exhibit 2, sorry. And if we go to page 14 of that, there's a study topology. And in that figure, you can see the footprint that we model as part of the resource adequacy study. So when we look at North and South Carolina, we're not only modeling all the utilities in Carolina, but we're also modeling Southern Company, TVA, parts of PJM, both PJM South and PJM West, and we extend all the way out to Kentucky and AECI, Missouri. And that footprint represents the SEAM market footprint. So we go an extensive, or we model an extensive footprint to understand what is our neighbor assistance, what's the benefit that we have of those interconnections. And so we're trying to capture the weather diversity that we have with those neighbors, as well as the generator outage diversity we have with those neighbors. So if it's really cold here, unfortunately it's typically cold throughout the Southeast. And so we've seen that neighbor assistance that we're modeling decrease as neighbors have also gone through a similar transition as the companies, more winter planning. As we add more solar to the system, that's pushed all the utilities, surrounding utilities, to more winter planning, making the market assistance that we can count on during those extreme cold winter periods, as was seen in Elliott, much less than what we saw in the 2020 study.
And so just to confirm, the neighbors you're referring to are the companies and entities that you referred to in your Exhibit 2, page 14.
That's correct, and there's a list on page 13 of the same exhibit.
And would you agree that if any of the updated generator performance assumptions were incorrect, that could affect your analysis?
If we look at the study, it's pretty comprehensive. Any assumption could move the needle up or down. Certainly, if we have new assumptions on generator performance, like we did this study, it can move. If we have less neighbor assistance this time, load forecast error, we have a lot of large loads, as discussed by the previous panel, coming online there. So there's lots of things that can occur. We can't really narrowly look at one item and say, hey, the reserve margin's wrong or right. We're going to get new data. We're going to update. And as of right now, when this study was done, everything points to a 22% reserve margin.
And by this study, you're referring to the 2023 resource adequacy study?
That's correct.
And your testimony also describes this wind ELCC study, and that is not the same thing, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe the resource adequacy study determines planning the reserve margin, while the wind ELCC study, you said in your testimony, determines wind ELCC values to use in Duke's expansion planning modeling. Is that right?
That's correct.
So can you, in layman's terms, explain the overlap, if any, in the subject matter of the two studies? Or are they totally separate?
Yeah, I mean, they are interrelated because they're calculated within the same model. When I think about ELCC for solar, storage, and wind, we're looking for the effective load carrying capability. That's what it stands for. So we're wanting to understand, if I add this resource, how much more load can I add to the system and stay at the same reliability level? So the wind ELCC is looking at, if I add this onshore or offshore wind, how much load can I add and maintain the same level of reliability? Whereas the resource adequacy study is really looking at, on an entire system picture, how many megawatts of capacity do I need to maintain reliability, which is then converted to a reserve margin, which is 22%, which is really just taking the resources minus the peak demand divided by the peak demand to get that reserve margin.
Okay. And I believe you had testified that Astrapa used the SERV-M model. That's a proprietary model. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a model that Astrapa licenses to users across the country.
And was that the same model that Astrapa used for Duke in North Carolina for its carbon plan IRP that's currently pending?
Yes, the resource adequacy study and the ELCC study was used for both North Carolina and South Carolina modeling using SERV.
And one last area of clarification from your direct testimony. On page 7, you're talking about weather years being simulated. 43 weather years were simulated. It appears at lines 19 to page 7, line 19.
Yes, I'm there.
What was the source of that data?
Yeah, so we're simulating for a future year. So our study year for the resource adequacy study was 2027. And so we're simulating if we were to have the last 43 years of weather in 2027, what would happen? So we're looking at 1980 through 2022. And that weather data from a temperature standpoint is just from NOAA. And it's used to develop synthetic load shapes that say, hey, in 2027, if we have 1985 weather again, this is what our load shape looks like. And so it provides mild and extreme weather years for us to look at. As part of resource adequacy, you're wanting to find those high impact, low probability events such as Winter Storm Elliott. You want to be able to understand what happens during those events. And so the weather is related to load, but it also is related to solar and wind. Solar and wind changes as weather changes, as well as thermal resources can change. The capacity changes as we shift temperatures. Typically, a gas unit is going to produce more in the extreme cold than it would in a summer day.
Okay, so the source of your data was from NOAA as for the temperatures, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But what location were you looking at? Here in South Carolina or where?
Yeah, so it's a combined system. So we use weather stations in North and South Carolina, and I'm pretty sure it's in my Exhibit 2. We go to Exhibit 2, page 15. We see the weather stations that were actually used. So it's a mix of North Carolina and South Carolina weather stations.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eaton. Office of Regulatory Staff, any questions?
No questions.
Thank you very much. Any redirect? Or you want them commissioner questions first? I'm sorry. Commissioner questions? Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Thank you for being here, Mr. Wintermantle. On page 15 of your testimony, you talk about, and maybe you just want to read that sentence out loud, because I just would like you to clarify what that sentence means. It's at the bottom of page 15, lines 11 through 14.
So you're talking, the question, why were there different solar portfolios evaluated in conjunction with the wind portfolios?
Well, and you talk about synergistic and deleterious. I've had to think about how to say that, effects on each other. And I'm just trying to understand what maybe I'm particularly, I get the synergistic part. The deleterious part, I don't get.
Yeah, you're right. We don't typically see the deleterious part very often, and I don't think we've seen it in this study. But we want to check and make sure that these resources aren't interacting in a way where we would see this kind of negative impact. What we see is that solar and storage put on the system together, especially in the summer, provide a synergistic value. It's actually a little less in the winter, but if you imagine in the summer, it makes a lot of sense. Your peak load is in hours, say 14 through 16, so that afternoon period. If I add a significant amount of solar, as the companies have, thousands of megawatts of solar on the system, we push what we call the net peak load. So it's load minus any of the renewable profiles that we're going to have. We push that out to later in the evening, but it's interesting is that it narrows the peak. And so without that solar, we have this broad peak in the afternoon. And then when we add a lot of solar late in the evening, it can narrow the peak. And that actually allows storage to provide more capacity value than it otherwise would have. We don't quite see that benefit in the winter. I think there is some, because that energy does help make it more of a needle peak in the early morning, but it's not nearly as much as we see in the summer. But what happens in the winter is we're adding in that solar across the day. It pushes back the resource adequacy risk to even more in the morning, to where maybe a more needle peak is formed and the storage can get some benefit because that solar was there. So when you add these resources together, there can be interactions, and so that's all we're saying there.
Okay. But you're also saying, I didn't hear any examples of deleterious impact.
Yeah, I don't recall seeing any of those with the technologies we are examining here.
Okay. And I noticed that on page 16, you've got reference to onshore and offshore. When you, with what you were just talking about, was that onshore and offshore, or just one kind of wind source?
So we looked at them independently with different levels of solar. I think the assumption is that, and again, it's more of a summertime phenomenon, but when we add a bunch of solar and move that net peak load later in the day, wind can actually have a higher ELCC in the summer. I don't know that we really see that synergistic value between solar and wind in the winter. But for this analysis, we looked at onshore wind at different levels of solar capacity, and then we looked at offshore wind at different levels of solar capacity.
And can you generally describe the differences in the impact between onshore and offshore and how it relates to solar? And maybe, I don't see it in table 2, but maybe there's a better place to...
I wouldn't say in the winter there's this strong relationship between solar and wind. I mean, what we do see is we're thinking about how a wind profile might look like in the Carolinas, and we're using the best data that the company has available for onshore and offshore profiles. I can say that we see, just if we look at the table 3, kind of average wind ELCC results, is that the profiles of offshore wind do provide higher capacity value than onshore, which just means that the output during those key morning hours, call it hour 5 to 9, the offshore wind is performing better with the estimates we have.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I believe when you were talking about the island scenario, there was a reference to a 28.5% winter reserve margin. Does that sound familiar?
Let me check.
And my question really is, how did you arrive at 22% being adequate given that relationship, that concern about the island scenario?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure, Commissioner Williams, and I'm looking to see if it's in my direct. We looked at individual scenarios as an island. So Duke Energy Carolinas DEC as an island, and also DEP as an island. And then we looked at a combined case with them as an island. And that's really more of an academic exercise, because we know they're interconnected. We want to count that benefit, but we want to be careful and understand what that benefit is. And we've seen that benefit decrease. But I believe the 28% that you're talking about is for the higher numbers for DEC, and that the combined case island was more in the 25% range. So when we model the combined case, we're modeling DEC and DEP together, but we model them with not that footprint of neighbors. So them as an island to meet the target without any help from neighbors. I would like to find the number, but subject to check, I think it's 25%. But when we turn on the neighbors in the modeling and we get some of that benefit on some of those cold days, not every cold day, but there are some periods where PJM has excess or TVA has excess and they can send it to the companies. When we run that analysis, which is a probabilistic analysis, lots of iterations of different weather profiles, as we've already discussed, what the results show that a 22% reserve margin when we turn on the interconnections is the right number for the combined case.
Thank you. Appreciate the background.
Sure.
Any further commissioner questions? Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, and roll tide. Pained me.
Roll tide.
Pained me. Getting back to that 25% for the combined DEC DEP system. And I don't remember all the details of the report, but during Winter Storm Elliott, was there, were our neighbors sharing much of their electricity during that period of time?
You know, I think Witness Holman is likely going to give you a more accurate picture, but my understanding is that there was very little support from neighbors during that event, that PJM also had extreme peak periods, and they had a lot of generators offline, and even other neighboring regions saw similar circumstances, and that there was not a lot of power shared during that event. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think Witness Holman can better speak to that.
And thinking about that, in events such as that, you know, winter vortex, whatever it is, maybe solar, that generally doesn't just affect Pickens County or Columbia, doesn't it generally affect larger areas?
It does. I mean, I could say it moves from west to east typically, or however it's moving. So there's some movement there, but I agree with you, Commissioner. Typically the extreme ones are a large footprint, and that's what we see in our analysis. So that doesn't still mean that, hey, maybe TVA is actually having a great winter period and they have all their generators are offline and they've got some margin. That wasn't seen in Winter Storm Elliott, but that's what we're wanting to capture is, stochastic modeling. So we're doing probabilistic analysis. Maybe the generators are performing well elsewhere, and we want to capture that. But you're right, and I think it's clear that generally these events are across a wide footprint.
If it's happening to DEC, DEP, it's probably happening to your neighbors.
Yeah, and hopefully that's in the modeling correctly.
And with that 25% combined, and I think your modeling and final assessment was 22%, that leaves about a 3% gap, but you're not concerned about that because of the modeling or the probability of that happening, or what?
I mean, I think their neighbor assistance exists. We can use our neighbors opportunistically, but we need to make sure we do have firm contract capacity for, we're saying at least a minimum 22% reserve margin. But then there is this kind of non-firm interplay that can happen, and our analysis shows that if we model that in a reasonable manner, it's worth about a 3% reduction in reserve margin. If we wanted to take more of a conservative approach, and say we don't want to count on our neighbors at all, then that would be the 25% combined case. But I do think we know the utilities are interconnected, and history has shown there has been some market assistance there. But since the 2020 study, we have seen it decrease substantially as all regions are experiencing this winter planning risk. It used to be there were some that were maybe not quite transitioning as fast as the companies in this case, and so maybe they had a little extra because they still had some summer LOLE risk. But now what we're seeing is all utilities surrounding, including PJM, you've seen in their latest analysis, is the risk is in the winter. So that extreme cold day is what we're focused on, and we are assuming some benefit of neighbors in our study.
I think your background and training is mechanical engineering, right?
That's correct.
And you're familiar with the not scientific law, but Murphy's Law?
Right.
What's the basic premise of Murphy's Law?
I believe if it can go wrong, it's going to go wrong.
If it can go wrong, it'll go wrong at the worst time it can. Generally. Well, at least my experience, that's what happened. But, and again, I'm not arguing that 25's right, 22's right. I don't. But is it possible that scenario could occur?
Well, and that scenario does occur in our model, and so that makes up kind of the 1 day in 10-year event. If you look in the runs that we actually do shed load, which is, we're not ever going to build the system to perfect reliability. That would probably require greater than 30%. So I think we always have to kind of level set that we're not building to never load shed ever. We're building to one event in 10 years. And so that event typically looks like very low market assistance, extreme cold. Maybe our generators aren't performing as well. And that causes the event. But I don't want to sit here and say that we're ever going to have a system that has no risk of firm load shed on these cold winter days, but we want to build enough to where it doesn't happen very often.
I understand. And that's pretty much comes down to probability and what risk are you willing to take and with the LOLE.
That's right. And I think the industry standard of 1 day in 10 years has served the industry well. And that is what is most commonly used across the industry.
We also talk about the updated generator performance assumptions going into, I guess, moving from 17% reserve to 22%. Could you elaborate on that some? What do you mean updated generator performance?
So
assumptions?
we use a data-driven process, so we're looking at 5 years of history. So yeah, in the last study, we looked at 2014 to 2019 data. If we were just to look at the fleet's forced outage rate during that period versus the last 5 years, 2018 through 2022, we see an uptick in forced outage rates kind of as a system fleet. So that gets baked into the new study, which causes more risk, right, on those of cold weather events. Now we have a potential for higher probability of losing some of our resources. And so in order to kind of compensate for that, it requires a higher reserve margin.
So that considered that last time period and considered and included Winter Storm Elliott and the effects from that.
Yes, sir.
So relative to those performance assumptions, did you evaluate the performance assumptions such as, was it from lines freezing? Was it, did you go into that detail, or was it just, well, it wasn't working?
I would say it's a combination. So what I'll call just non-weather related forced outages across some of the aging fleet had gone up So non-weather related force outages had gone up, but also we saw an uptick in the weather related outages. But I know the companies, and again, I think Witness Holman can probably speak to this, but just kind of the winterization efforts that are going in, and since Winter Storm Elliott, a lot of lessons learned and that sort of thing are being applied, and so you know we're gonna continue to look at it. This was a 2027 with the fleet at 2027. I think the company we say a resource adequacy study should be conducted every couple of years or when data changes significantly. So we'll continue to look at the fleet operations and update the resource adequacy study.
So the additional reserve margin is also because of those performance assumptions. So since the history is the performance was this, X, we need to provide 5% more reserve margin to compensate for such as that.
Yeah, I would just add, Commissioner, those are inputs into the modeling. Of course, we run the simulations and it tells us we're not just taking those numbers and putting an adder on reserve margin. It's comprehensive analysis in the simulations that result in the increase. And that's one component of the increase in reserve margin.
I understand it's just a model and you put stuff in it. I guess. Well, along those lines, if those facilities that froze or whatever, and I think after that, the companies were going to go back and really beef them up, make sure their heat trace works, you know, all the things that fail, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again to the best of our ability. If that occurred, or if that occurs, does that still necessitate that extra reserve margin, or will it take, since it's a data point or data, will it take more time to go through cold weather to prove that it didn't freeze, they did everything they needed to do, and it works fine? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the next time the companies want to update the study, we will certainly look at the recent historical performance, and if what you said is true, there's been an improvement, then that would feed into the study. But I would just want to add that there's a long list of assumptions that could change as part of that in a year from now or 2 years, whenever the study is next conducted. I mean, we're hearing about large customer loads that may have extremely high load factors. Is the neighbor assistance that we just talked about, is that the right number? So we want to look at every variable and understand. And I can't sit here today and say that, hey, the reserve margin won't go higher the next time we look at it, but we'll keep the data-driven process and try to account for all these risks.
And that's just one variable of many.
That's right.
Okay. Finally, I was just looking at it, and I don't know where I saw it, but you know, you talk about 4% outage rate represents the high end of thermal sources, and I guess trying to get the other sources, solar, wind, and such, on equal footing. Use the 4% as on the higher end. If for those thermal units, if in your modeling you'd have used, say, low outage percentage or medium outage percentage of those, would that have changed anything appreciably?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. So the existing fleet, we have good data on, right? And that's in the model. And that, you know, for our coal, our older coal, gas, all that is baked in. What we're talking about here is a new gas resource. And so we want to compare on an equal playing field. We want to look at all the technologies. We want to look at gas versus solar versus storage. And as part of this ELCC framework where we're determining the capacity value or the capacity contribution of these resources, we realize gas has a forced outage rate. And so we're making an an adjustment to ensure they're on an equal playing field. So we're not forcing solar to be compared in the ELCC work against a perfect load, because we know gas isn't at 100% either. It has a forced outage rate, so we're kind of putting them on an equal playing field. So we're really, what we're capturing in our solar and storage ELCC study is the variable, the intermittent nature of a solar and wind resource, just because it's dependent on the weather, and also the energy limitations of a storage resource. It may only be available for 2 hours or 4 hours, depending on what the storage resource. That's really what we want to capture, the difference between a gas and these other resources. And so in order to do that, we've modeled the solar and storage resources against not a perfect load, but a load that has a 4% outage rate, so they're on equal playing field. Because we believe a new gas resource, kind of the high end of a forced outage rate of a new gas resource is going to be 4%.
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to understand, you know, the high end of the thermal source. I mean, I know what high end means, but I'm not real sure what it means here. Like, was it selected just to get it to where it's makes it, I guess, more equal to comparing the other things? I mean, what is it normally? I don't know what high is. Is it normally this, but we're going to put it up here? I mean,
yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I'm pretty sure, and maybe this is for the modeling panel, maybe Mr. Quinto, but the combined cycle forced outage rate, I believe, is 4%. Like, that's just kind of the generic E4. And if we look at a CT, maybe it's a little bit lower. And so regardless, these are fairly low outage rates on new gas units is what's expected and kind of what we've seen in history. And we're just trying to make sure we're not penalizing the solar and storage in our analysis. And so 4% kind of is a reasonable number for a new gas unit forced outage rate.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Wintermantle. Wish we could talk football some, but they'll be upset. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cass. And any further, Commissioner Williams?
Thank you. One more quick question. From Exhibit 2, in the winter peak weather variability charts, there is a really significant impact that is about 29 years ago in 1985. This has more to do with my just understanding this, but also thinking about, are we over protecting ourselves? Once that 1985 data comes out of your analysis, will there be a significant change? Or have I totally misunderstood?
No, I mean, I would say, well, let me ask, just to clarify, when you're saying, would there be a change, you're just saying a change in the reserve margin from last time?
Right. Are we in going from 17 to 22, if that 1985 data weren't in this 30-year period, would it impact needing to go to 22%?
So the way we look at the data is we want to take it as it comes.
I know.
I mean, if I were to lower that number, yeah, mathematically there could be some small difference. Now, it's a 1 in 43 year probability in the analysis, so it's going to be, there will be an impact if I lower the risk I'm putting into the model. But the fact that it's 1 in 43 years, it's probably relatively small. But I'm, just as a reliability planner, resource adequacy planner, I'm very hesitant to remove an event. And I know you're not going there, but that just...
You answered my question. It's going to be a small impact because it's it's 1 year's impact.
Yeah.
So.
And how much are you going to lower it, and all that comes into play.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Wintermantle, what does this 4 or 5 year increase cost customers?
Chairman Powers, I'm not sure I can answer that. I think that's probably a question for the modelers. We did not perform any cost analysis.
No financial analysis. Okay. And, you know, I hear a lot about Winter Storm Elliott, and it was not just a weather event. It was pretty much a Murphy's Law sort of thing too. A lot of other things went wrong. Equipment didn't work. Things froze up. It wasn't just weather that affected that particular storm, was it?
Yeah, the weather certainly increased. There was significant load response throughout the southeast footprint and into PJM. Certainly, lots of generators failed during that time as well, which I think is where you're going. So yeah, a lot. That is the event that we're trying to capture in our modeling.
And you know, you talked about a several year sort of thing that you used to compare. And at the same time, we're hearing about glaciers melting, the oceans getting deeper, the storms here, fires here. How do you figure or put any of that into your analysis? I mean, is the weather changing? Is the world changing? Do you put anything of that into your?
Yeah, I'm not a climatologist. Our best assumption of what can occur in the future is based on the last 40 years of data. To your point, if these events are occurring more frequently, that's in the data. We know we had the polar vortex in 14 and 15. We had a really cold event in 18, cold event in 22. That's baked in as it's occurred in history. To try to trend that out and understand the frequency of these events moving forward is challenging.
So you've been using historical data only?
For this analysis, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Any redirect?
No redirect, and I would ask that Mr. Wintermantle be excused.
Okay. This may be a good time for us to take a afternoon break, maybe about 10 or 12. Let's just come back 4 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome back. We're back on the record in the Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas IRP case, and ready for Duke to call your next witness.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Duke Energy calls Mr. Samuel Holloman to the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Marco. Come forward and be sworn. And for the record, all commissioners are present in the hearing room.
If you would raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Holloman, would you please state your full name for the record?
Yes, my name's John Samuel Holman III.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy Corporation. My current title is Vice President, Special Projects, Grid Planning and Integration. At the time of my testimony filing, my direct testimony filing, my title was Vice President of Transmission System Operations and Planning.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared 18 pages of direct testimony pre-filed with the Commission on October 24th, 2023?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
Other than my title, no, I do not.
If I asked you the same questions that were asked in your pre-filed direct testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Mr. Holloman's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Holman will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Holloman, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared one exhibit labeled Holloman Direct Exhibit 1 that was prepared in support of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes or corrections to your exhibit at this time?
No, I do not.
Chair Powers, I would ask that Mr. Holloman's pre-filed direct exhibit labeled Holloman Direct Exhibit 1 be entered as the next composite hearing exhibit.
The pre-filed direct exhibit of witness Holman identified as Holman Direct Exhibit 1 is marked for identification and will be placed in the record as exhibit number 8.
Thank you, Chair Powers. And Mr. Holloman, for clarity, will you be appearing again in the rebuttal phase of this proceeding?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. And did you prepare a summary of your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please present that for the Commission?
Yes, I will. My testimony supports and highlights several key themes addressed in Appendix M, Reliability and Operational Resiliency, of the company's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, or the Resource Plan. My testimony demonstrates that system reliability is a core planning and operating requirement in the company's resource plan development process. I also provide a system operator's perspective of the reliability risks to the company's systems and testify to the IRP's approach to mitigating those risks, including real-world examples of the operational challenges facing the company. After introducing my direct testimony in Section 1, in Section 2, I explained the company's responsibility to ensure adequate power supply and reliability of the grid. I highlight that the companies fulfill a federally mandatory obligation and essential public service to plan and operate their generation fleets, transmission systems, and distribution systems to provide reliable power system operations to their company year-round. I also highlight that the companies fulfill their CERC Reliability Corporation obligations and as a part of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. I explained that the companies continue to promote system reliability as a core planning and operating requirement in developing the resource plan, including by addressing the IRP statute balancing of factors, especially those regarding reliability and adequacy. In Section 3, I provide an overview of the reliability risks the companies are currently facing, changing energy landscape, the company's ongoing energy transition, and supply chain issues that are current risks to reliability. I then explain the significance of the diverse resource mix and how we mitigate those reliability risks. I also discuss the importance of an orderly pace of the energy transition, highlighting how it promotes resiliency and reliability of the system. In Section 4 of my testimony, I discuss how the companies have approached reliability in developing the IRP. I reiterate that maintaining reliability is a core planning focus of the resource plan. The companies have a public service obligation to plan and operate their generation fleets, transmission systems, and distribution systems to provide reliable electric service to all of our customers at all hours of the day, every day of the year, in all weather and grid conditions. Accordingly, system operators need diverse resources available in real time to meet the demands placed on the power system by high loads and unexpected events such as generator outages or low renewable output. In conclusion, I highlight that the resource planning process is a critical step in ensuring future system reliability because it defines the composition and timing of the changes to the company's resource mix that will enable an orderly energy transition. I highlight 3 high-level reliability considerations to balance in preparing the resource plan. Number 1, resource plan execution risk as they translate into operational risk if adequate resources are unavailable to meet the load growth. Number 2, pace of the energy transition to ensure that new resources perform as expected and can contribute fully to the power system's reliability. And number 3, a balanced and diverse portfolio of resources that limits the risk of delay or nonconformance from any other type of resource. This concludes my direct testimony summary.
Thank you, Mr. Holloman. Chair Powers, at this time, Mr. Holloman is available for questions from the parties in the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Marco. Any questions from Sierra Club?
No questions from Sierra Club.
Thank you. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
No questions, but thank you.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Safe Upstate Forever, and Vote Solar.
No questions.
Walmart.
No questions.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll reserve our cross for when Mr. Holloman comes up for rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Torrey. Anything from commissioners at this time? Commissioners will reserve their questions as well. Thank you, Mr. Holman.
Chair Powers, can Mr. Holloman be excused until he returns?
Yes, he can be excused.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, the companies call Tim Duff and Teresa Reed to the stand.
Please come forward and be sworn. Welcome back.
It's good to be back.
When you're ready, if you would raise your right hands, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Reed, would you please state your name for the record?
My name is Teresa Reed.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy Business Services, LLC, and I'm the Director of Rates and Regulatory Planning.
Ms. Reed, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 15 pages of direct testimony that was pre-filed with the commission in this proceeding?
Yes.
And if I ask you the same questions that were asked in your pre-filed direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would ask that Mrs. Reed's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Ms. Reed will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Reed, would you please provide a summary of your testimony at this time?
Yes. In my direct testimony, I provide an overview of the company's rate design and customer program efforts that support the company's 2023 IRP. In 2021, the companies began a comprehensive rate design study which involved extensive engagement with stakeholders. This process has resulted in new time of use windows and demand charge structures that better align price signals with system cost and improve customers' ability to respond to price signals and control costs. New rate designs for non-residential customers that include a redesigned hourly pricing option and rates supportive of customers adopting EVs. These options help shrink the challenge associated with the overall load growth the companies are experiencing and shift usage from on-peak to off-peak hours. The company's new TOU rate designs and EV programs are critical to managing load growth in South Carolina. Generally speaking, these modernized rate designs are superior to the prior designs in terms of effectively enabling beneficial customer response. The companies anticipate that the new periods will be more manageable and valuable to avoid customers with flexible loads, and the new hourly pricing and critical peak pricing designs are foundational for the realization of capacity benefits, which occurs only after customers modify consumption practices in response to price signals. My testimony also discusses the rapidly growing pace of EV adoption across the Carolinas, which is forecasted to continue to grow due to federal incentives, automaker commitments to increase EV sales, and increased availability. The companies have pursued a three-pronged approach to accommodating the projected impacts of accelerating EV adoption, including programs to ensure available charging infrastructure, programs to help manage EV loads' impact on system peaks, and evaluation of operating regions to determine where strategic planning is needed to incorporate clusters of fleet operators without jeopardizing system reliability. With respect to the expansion of rooftop solar across the Carolinas, I explained that customers are increasingly pursuing solar paired with storage. The companies are continuing to explore ways to create grid benefits for the larger systems, such as investments are made by individual customers. Finally, my testimony discusses the company's new clean energy programs, including the recently approved Green Source Advantage modifications and Renewable Choice and Clean Energy Impact programs, which are critical to both existing and potential new customers as they are looking for ways to meet their sustainability goals. The companies are confident that the programs and rate designs they have collaboratively developed with stakeholders will continue to support reliable and affordable service through the promotion and use of demand management, support the integration of EVs, and give customers more options and control over how they use energy. This concludes my direct testimony summary.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. And just to confirm, you did not file rebuttal testimony, is that correct?
I did not file rebuttal testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Mr. Duff, would you please state your name for the record?
Yes. My name is Timothy J. Duff.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am employed by Duke Energy Business Services as the General Manager of Customer Solutions Regulatory Enablement.
And Mr. Duff, did you prepare or cause to be prepared 22 pages of direct testimony, which was pre-filed with the Commission in this proceeding this past Friday, September 13th, 2024?
Yes, I did.
And if I asked you the same questions that were asked in your pre-filed direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would ask that Mr. Duff's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Duff will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Duff, did you also prepare or cause to be prepared 2 exhibits that were attached to your pre-filed direct testimony and labeled as Duff Direct Exhibit 1 and Duff Direct Exhibit 2?
Yes.
And do you have any changes to the exhibits at this time?
No, not to my knowledge.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that Mr. Duff's 2 pre-filed exhibits labeled Duff Direct Exhibit 1 and Duff Direct Exhibit 2 be entered into the record as the next hearing composite exhibit.
The pre-filed exhibits of witness Duff identified as Duff Direct 1 and Duff Direct Exhibit 2 will be placed in the, or marked for identification, will be placed in the record as exhibit number 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Duff, just to confirm, you did file rebuttal testimony. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Mr. Duff, would you please provide a summary of your direct testimony at this time?
Sure. In my direct testimony, I provide an overview of the company's Grid Edge and customer program efforts, which enable customer investments in EE, DSM, voltage management, and other distributed energy resources. Grid Edge programs are those programs that combine customer offerings with utilities technology to help the companies manage the overall electric system and shape load in ways that allow the companies to defer or even eliminate the need for future generation. The companies rely on these programs to shrink the challenge by reducing and shifting the load to be served, reducing costs for customers, and adding to and enhancing an increasingly clean resource mix. The companies remain regional leaders in delivering energy savings for our customers and are at the forefront of Grid Edge program innovation and development. Since 2017, EEDSM programs have saved nearly $6.5 billion in the Carolinas, with $1.5 billion in fuel and bill savings flowing directly back to South Carolina customers. Relevant to this proceeding, the companies modeled a base case assumption of a minimum annual reduction of 1% of eligible load from EE savings, as well as sensitivities assuming an annual savings floor of 1.5% of eligible retail sales and annual savings floor of 1% using the 2022 load forecasts. These forecasts were informed by the 2023 Market Potential Study, the development of which is outlined in my testimony. Specifically, the Market Potential Study employed more aggressive modeling techniques to capture more savings potential. These techniques included using the UCT, or Utility Cost Test, to evaluate economic potential, basing customer adoption assumptions on customer payback, and assessing the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, on EE adoption. As a result, the company's base forecast using 1% of eligible load minimum annual savings floor saw the total amount of annual energy savings increase by over 4,900 gigawatt hours, with annual EE savings over the 28-year period increasing by over 11% for DEP and over 18% for DEC between 2022 and the 2023 forecasts. In my testimony, I also discussed challenges to achieve EE savings of 1% of annual eligible load. For example, favorable economic development bringing large commercial and industrial customers to the Carolinas and increasing adoption of EVs are increasing the amount of megawatt hour savings needed to meet the 1% annual floor, but they present little opportunity for the companies to create EE savings. Notwithstanding these other challenges, the companies believe that the existing forecasted level of energy savings with a 1% minimum floor for modeling is an aggressive but reasonable path for forecasting long-term utility EE used in resource planning. My testimony also highlights the updates to the company's EEDSM programs to deliver forecasted levels of energy savings, the initiatives the companies are undertaking to increase their winter peak demand capability, the company's continued investment in and implementation of voltage optimization, the impact of which are reflected in the IRP. In short, the companies continue to strive for aggressive EEDSM assumptions and remain committed to growing and improving their EEDSM programs, including those for income qualified customers. As the companies navigate the energy transition, this concludes my direct testimony summary.
Thank you, Mr. Duff. Mr. Chairman, the panel is available for questions from the parties and the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Gissendammer. As far as cross-examination, we'll start with Sierra Club,
No questions from Sierra Club.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League,
No questions.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association,
No questions for Sasiba, but thank you.
Walmart,
No questions, thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
No questions for Ms. Reed. We'll reserve for Mr. Duff.
Thank you very much. Commissioner questions. Commissioner Williams.
Ms. Reed, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
In your testimony, you talk about rate design modernization, and this is, I just feel compelled to ask you this, seeing that title, but do you look at data centers and how data centers might get a fair rate assigned to them? And I'll admit, I didn't see it in your testimony, but it's a lot of what we're thinking about in this IRP. And so I wanted to, this is my one chance to ask you.
Absolutely. So about a month or two ago, the companies filed a updated ESA, which is an electric service agreement. And in that updated electric service agreement, we put in there performance provisions as well as credit provisions for customers with large load. And so the purpose of those additional provisions in the contract allows us to have additional protections for other customers related to that large load. So for example, and every customer would be unique based on their characteristics, the company could assign a performance provision of 75% of contract demand, which means that if that customer does not show up with the load that they told us that they would show up with, we would have the ability to bill them for 75% of that contract demand. And what that does is it does protect other customers. So we are thinking about that in terms of how we can protect other customers while maintaining rates and rate schedules that are equal and fair to all customers.
And in terms of the actual rate, let's say somebody predicts accurately what they need, they develop, and they're using a comparable amount of energy than what they told you. Is the allocation appropriate, or is there any cost shift from a use like a data center to other customers?
So that will be determined once we get to a rate case, but those customers would be grouped with our larger customers. So we would have to determine what that impact is at that time. It's hard to say today without seeing all the impacts and all that. And you do know that large customers also contribute to the building of infrastructure through CIAC, which is contribution in aid of construction, and other forms of contribution. And then I think someone mentioned earlier about our ACE tariffs, our Accelerating Clean Energy transition type tariffs. So that would allow those customers also, when those items are developed, to have on-site generation, storage, maybe contribute financially to the development of some such resources. So it's just hard to say right now until we get into a rate case, we see a large customer and see what the impact is.
And is there also a factor in terms of kind of the economies of scale of getting that much data to that kind of customer?
So I'm not sure if I quite understand your
I think
question.
I said the wrong word. That much energy to that kind of customer.
So in terms of infrastructure, so for example, additional transmission and distribution, there are definitely additional costs associated with that. And based on the size of the customer, we do calculations to determine what proportion of those costs those customers would bear directly for that type of scale. So again, it depends on the size of each customer and the operating characteristics of whatever it is that they're manufacturing or doing at that site.
So your testimony is really that it depends site by site, use by use?
It really does, because you have to think of like a manufacturing facility versus a data center versus another type of business has different load characteristics and usage characteristics. So it's hard to say how that impacts the system until it actually does impact the system, until we actually have costs that we then have to assign.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Any further commissioner questions? Ms. Reed, I just have a couple of questions. There's so much talk about the growth of electric vehicles, but I think what I've been seeing is more of a growth in hybrid type vehicles. Has the demand slowed down any, or do you have anything to reflect one way or the other about the growth?
So I'm not sure what's put into the model that is determinable of the IRP filing. This was filed a year ago, but we have seen a slowdown a little bit in EV adoption, but there are a number of things we have to consider. We also have to consider fleet EV adoption, which is very different than, let's say, residential adoption. So,
like school buses?
Correct. So there's just different markets, I guess, different areas that we would have to consider, though we may have seen a slowdown on the more residential, kind of light duty type of vehicle. Okay. Other areas we're considering. In my testimony, I talk about fleet clusters.
Looking at what Commissioner Williams was asking you, and you said there would be a way to recoup money from these companies if something were to happen. What if one of these companies folds or goes bankrupt? How, after you've provided such a large load, who pays for it then?
That is a good question. So in addition to the performance provisions, we've also added credit provisions where the company can get cash from riskier customers up front, which we would hold in the off chance that those customers did not show up. So each customer, like I said, is different. It's hard to compare. It's based on the balance sheet strength of the particular party. That would determine what level of credit we would require, or letter of credit or cash or whatever it is that our credit and risk department would need from that particular type of customer.
Thank you very much. That's all I have. Any other commissioner questions? All right. Any redirect? Mr. Gissendanner.
No redirect, Chair Powers. We would ask that this panel be excused.
Thank you. She will be. And of course, as to Mr. Duff, the commissioners reserve any questions for after your rebuttal.
Chair Powers, we have moved unexpectedly efficiently today, and I credit you for that and appreciate that. What that means, although we've put up 8 witnesses today, many more than I think we expected, we have 1 witness that we're available to take out of order and virtually, if that pleases the commission. Otherwise, we'll have to restart tomorrow morning again, if that pleases the chair.
You have the virtual witness ready now? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir, that's right.
Okay, and do you have any guess as to how long that witness may take?
I believe he'd be very short, and he's supposed to come back and rebuttal. It's Ben Smith addressing Bad Creek 2.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, I can hear all the cash registers running, but let's take another one.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. In that case, the companies would now call Benjamin Smith to the stand.
There's no objection to this by any other party, is there? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith, would you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Mr. Smith. Would you please state your full name for the record?
Yes, Benjamin Smith.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy LLC, Duke Energy Carolinas LLC, and I'm Generation and Regulatory Strategy Director.
Did you prepare cause to be prepared 9 pages of pre-filed direct testimony that were filed with the commission in this proceeding?
I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions that appear in your pre-filed direct testimony this afternoon, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I move that Mr. Smith's pre-filed direct testimony be entered into the records if given orally from the stand.
The pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Benjamin Smith will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, have you prepared a summary of your direct testimony for the commission?
Yes, I have.
Would you please read that at this time?
Sure. In my direct testimony, I addressed Duke Energy Carolinas' planning and execution of pumped storage hydro, which is included in Chapter 4 in Appendix I of the company's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. The companies have over 50 years of experience with pumped storage hydro, which is a proven technology will enable more efficient use of other renewable and carbon-free resources. With the growth of solar on the system, these plants can be used to store excess energy during the day and provide energy during the system peaks. The expansion of the existing Bad Creek facility will provide system stability, flexibility to respond to system peaks and steep system ramps. My direct testimony provides an overview of Bad Creek 2 project and the benefits that additional pump storage hydro brings to the company's generation and resource mix. I also discussed the near-term action items needed for executing the second powerhouse at Bad Creek. This concludes the summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And just to clarify, you are coming back to testify in rebuttal, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Chair Powers, Mr. Smith is available for questioning from council and the commission.
Thank you very much. Any questions from Sierra Club?
No questions, thank you.
South Carolina Coastal, etc.
No questions.
All right. Clean Energy Business, Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
No questions at this time, but thank you.
Thank you. Walmart.
No questions.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. ORS will reserve for rebuttal.
All right, thank you very much. Commissioners, any questions, or do you want to reserve your questions? Commission will reserve questions for after the rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask that Mr. Smith be excused.
Mr. Smith is excused. That didn't take long.
That's right. Try to live up to my word. I believe that concludes the company's case for the day, if it pleases the commission.
Okay, so tomorrow, in case we do as well tomorrow as we do today, y'all gonna be ready?
We'll be ready for you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. This is unusual, but we will adjourn early. Tomorrow, I would like to start at 9:30, and please plan on running probably till about 6 o'clock. We still got a long way to go. We've had a good day, and everyone be safe going home. Thank you. We adjourn.